Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today we are revisiting the Pentium 3 going against the Pentium 4, specifically the battle at 1.4 GHz. So we have the Pentium 3 with the Tualatin core going against the Pentium 4 with the Willamette core. Now, we will also look at motherboards, we have a discussion about the memory, we will also look at processor coolers, and we'll have a look at how things were back in the day from a historic perspective, but also how things are now today from the point of view of building a retro gaming PC. So we also have some benchmarks, of course, and yeah, lots of interesting stuff in this video. So let's have a look at a bunch of Pentium 3 processors, starting with the older model here, which comes in the slot 1 form factor. So this Pentium 3 runs at 1000 MHz and it's got a 100 MHz frontside bus, and I believe this is the quickest Pentium 3 for slot 1. And later things moved on to the socket 370. Here we have the quickest models each. The one on the left is clocked a little bit higher at 1100 MHz, but it's got a lower frontside bus of only 100 MHz, whereas the one on the right runs at 1000 MHz, but it's got the higher 133 MHz frontside bus. The 133 MHz frontside bus models often have the donation EB at the end, so keep an eye out for that. So I ran both of these through some benchmarks, so let's have a look. And we can see that despite the 100 MHz faster Pentium 3, it is actually the Pentium 3 with the higher frontside bus that wins. So the Pentium 3 with 1000 MHz and a 133 MHz frontside bus is the quickest Pentium 3 for socket 370 from the Coppermine core generation. And here we've got the Pentium 3, the highlight of this video, the Tualatin running at 1.4 GHz. So it's got a 40% boost compared to the fastest Coppermine, but it also has double the cache, 512 kilobytes, and it's also manufactured in a smaller process, 130 nanometer, so it's quite low power as well. It launched in 2002, exactly on January the 8th, and it was targeted as a server processor with a good combination of performance and low power usage. I also have a price here in the Intel press release from 2002. We were looking at $315. Now we're going to have a look at some motherboards for the Pentium 3. This is a typical slot 1 motherboard. We've got an AGP 2X interface. There are 5 PCI slots, but we're also getting 2 ISA slots, which is awesome for retro gaming because we can use all those sound cards. It uses SDRAM, and the frontside bus officially runs at either 66 or 100 MHz. The chipset on this motherboard is the famous Intel 440BX, and this is one of the last motherboards that uses the traditional North Bridge, South Bridge configuration. So we have the North Bridge up here, and that connects to all the fast stuff, which is the processor, the memory, and the AGP port. And then through the PCI bus, it connects to all the PCI slots, and then to the South Bridge, which has the features like USB and the ID controller, the ISA slots, and so on. On the front of the motherboard, we can see this quite nicely. We've got traces going from the North Bridge to the AGP, over here to the RAM, and also to the processor. And on the back of the side, we can see nicely how the North Bridge has all these lanes going to the PCI slots. So everything down south basically was connected through the PCI bus. There was a bandwidth of 133 megabytes per second, and there was a bit of a worry that going forward that bandwidth would become a bottleneck. So moving on to newer chipsets, the architecture changed. And here we have an example of a more modern motherboard. This is what I've been using to get all the benchmark results. So this one has the Intel 815 chipset, and this uses the newer Intel Hub architecture. So we still have the chipset, and they called it memory controller hub. And again, all the fast stuff is connected to this. So the AGP port, which is now AGP4X, the memory, and of course the processor. And we still have a chip here, but it's not called the South Bridge. This is called the input-output controller hub, the ICH2. And this time it doesn't go through the PCI bus anymore because the bandwidth was only 133 megahertz. So there's a direct connection basically between these two hubs, running at 266 megahertz, so higher bandwidth. And then off here, we have the PCI bus connected. And as an upgrade, we got 4 USB ports instead of 2, and we're also getting faster storage controllers, ATA100. And unfortunately, the ISA interface had to go on the Intel 815 chipset, so it's PCI only. If you still want an ISA port on a fast Pentium 3, you gotta look out for motherboards with the VIA chipset. Here we have such an example. In terms of performance, they are similar enough. In some benchmarks, Intel is a little bit faster. In some benchmarks, VIA takes the lead. The main challenge or issue is really the AGP interface and the implementation with the BIOS. On NVIDIA cards, for example, the driver will detect that it's running on a VIA chipset, and usually, it depends a little bit on the driver version, but usually will slow down the speed to AGP2X to give it full stability. I've Radeon cards, ATR Ready cards, handled it a little bit differently. I've tried, for example, a 9600 XT, and that card would run in the 4x speed, but then you would have crashes in games and benchmarks to do with instability. Now there's a solution around that, and that has to do with the AGP drive strength. You need to enter a number in the BIOS, which is between 0 and 255, but it's expressed as a hexadecimal number, and you can just try out a few numbers until the stability is there, or you can get that AGP drive strength number from another motherboard and see if that works. But I just went for the middle ground, like I used decimal 128, and that gave me perfect stability with the Radeon 9600 XT in AGP4X mode. On the Pentium 3 platform, pretty much you're dealing with SDRAM memory. There are some RAM bus and DDR versions, but they're very rare and expensive and quite exotic. So in most cases, you're dealing with SDRAM memory. Here we've got a stick from Crucial, and it's running at 133 megahertz, and it's got a cache latency rating of 2. That means you can enter really tight, fast memory timings into the BIOS, and that's the sort of memory I would recommend. I haven't done any formal benchmarking for this video, but in the past I've looked at comparing cache latency 2 and 3, and there's definitely a noticeable difference. Back in the day, SDRAM memory was the established memory technology and therefore reasonably affordable, definitely a lot cheaper compared to the RDRAM, which the early Pentium 4 machines used. On eBay, if you look around, these are cheapest chips, so you shouldn't have an issue finding cheap SDRAM. And in terms of memory bandwidth, we're looking at 1066 megabytes per second on the Pentium 3. And now let's turn our attention to the Pentium 4. Let's start with the processor first. So this is the Pentium 4 with the Willamette core running at 1.4 GHz, and we've got 256 kilobytes of level 2 cache. Now the 400, that donates the frontside bus. So the real clock speed of the frontside bus is only 100 megahertz, but it uses quad data rate or quad pumped, as they say, and it just means that per clock cycle it can transfer 4 times the information. So therefore the effective clock speed is 400 megahertz, and bigger numbers are better for marketing, so they usually stick the effective memory speed on there. It's normal practice. It's the same thing now with video cards, if you look at the GDDR5 memory or with DDR memory, for example. And here we have the Pentium 4 motherboard or test system that we're going to use in this video. This uses the Intel 850 chipset, and it also uses the hub architecture. So we've got the same configuration with the memory controller hub here with the 850 chipset, and the same ICH2 input-output controller hub here. They are connected with the same 266 megahertz link compared to the Pentium 3. So in that regard, this motherboard is very similar to the Pentium 3. We have AGP 4X, we have PCI slots, we've got the same ATA 100 storage controllers, and we're getting 4 USB ports. So there's not much between them. The main difference is of course the memory technology. Intel went with SDRAM from a RAM bus, and the main difference is really the transfer speed. So firstly, they run in dual channel, and secondly, these are PC800 memory modules, so they're clocked a lot faster, and we're getting an insane memory bandwidth of 3,200 megabytes per second. So that's triple compared to the Pentium 3. We also have to talk about the CPU socket. If you're looking at building a very earlier, one of the first Pentium 4 systems, you have a choice of 2 sockets. You can go with the 423, which was the original socket, but it was very short-lived, or you can go with the later socket 478, which went on for a few more years. I went with the socket 478. The main difference is if you go with socket 423, you are stuck with the types of processors you can use. You can only use the Willamette processors, so you can't use the Northwood, you can't use the SDRAM processors. Also, you need a special power supply apparently, whereas if you go with the socket 478, you can use the faster Northwood processors. You can use a standard ATX power supply, so it makes life a lot easier. The only processor that we can't test is the slowest, the 1.3 GHz version, but everything else you have a lot more, not a lot more, but you have some conveniences and more compatibility if you go with the socket 478. So I think it's time to find out how these two compare. So we've got the Pentium 3S running at 1.4 GHz against the second slowest Pentium 4, also clocked at 1.4 GHz. The differences are different motherboards, of course, with different memory technologies. Double the cache, we got 512 here compared to 256, but then the Pentium 4 has triple the memory bandwidth. So let's have a look at some results. And yeah, you'd think that triple the memory bandwidth and the newer architecture would make the Pentium 4 run faster, but the opposite is true. Here we have some benchmark results, and you can see across the board, the Pentium 3 is actually faster. It's only in Quake 3. That's a benchmark the Pentium 4 does really well in. Here it matches the Pentium 3, but in all the benchmarks, the Pentium 3 is faster, and in some benchmarks, significantly faster. For example, in MDK2, in Draken, and in Expendable, it is a lot faster. If we look at the score in Expendable, that's 40% faster at the same clock speed, so that's unbelievable. And this is the reason why a lot of retro gamers are really loving the Pentium 3, the Tualatin, because it offers so much performance compared to the first Pentium 4s. And here we have some DOS benchmark results. Across the board, we can see the Pentium 3 is faster again, but all of these processors offer playable frame rates in DOS, and the difference is not as striking. It's only in PC Player where the Pentium 3 is quite a bit faster. In the other benchmarks, the lead is not that massive, and in general, what I found with DOS benchmarking is that the clock speed is the main factor for performance. Now this is all really exciting stuff, but we have to have a look at the timeline of when these processors came out, and we have to ask ourselves, is it even fair to compare these two processors when we look at the timeline? So the 1.4 GHz Pentium 4 for socket 423 came out in November of 2000, and the socket 478 version, which is what we're using, came out in August of 2001. Compare that to the Tualatin. This one did not launch until January of 2002, so quite a bit later. And I've got a press release here from Intel that confirms all the dates. And I had a look what Pentium 4 was actually available when the Pentium 3S Tualatin launched, and it wasn't the 1.4 anymore. it had to go up against the 2.2 GHz Northwood. So one of the reasons Intel went with the net burst architecture was to ramp up clock speed as quickly as possible to outdo AMD, and also bigger numbers sell. People bought a machine, Pentium 4, in the supermarket with 2.2 GHz. That sounded a lot more impressive than a Pentium 3 running at 1.4 GHz. So both of these processors basically launched within days from each other. This has the newer Northwood core, which got more cache. It's got 512 kilobyte level 2 cache now, and also a smaller manufacturing process. This now is also on the 130 nanometer process. And yeah, let's have a look how these two compare. So now the tables have turned. The Pentium 4, thanks to the much higher clock speed and also the very fast memory architecture with the SDRAM memory, is now able to outperform the Tualatin. It's not a massive lead in most benchmarks, for example in Unreal Tournament or in Serious Sam. Yeah, we're getting around 25% or so. It's in Quake 3 once again. That benchmark just loves the Pentium 4. That we can see a much greater lead. And yeah, you could look at this in several ways. You could look at just the clock speed and say, well, for a 2.2 GHz chip, it's just a little bit faster than the Tualatin, so it's not that great. But remember, the whole strategy for the net burst was to ramp up the clock speed. And so IPC, or performance per clock, went out the window, and Intel just went for brute fastest clock speed to get as much performance out of this chip. And the Pentium 4 went on to, they just added more features to it. We got hyper-threading, and then we got also SDRAM and DDR-RAM, and then we got DDR dual channel memory, and then we got the Prescott core with a meg of level 2 cache, and so on. So they kept improving the Pentium 4. And that's something you have to keep in mind when comparing the Pentium 3 with the Pentium 4. Yes, if you take the very early Pentium 4, then the Pentium 3 will wipe the floor with it. But the Pentium 4 quickly, and within a year or so, was up to much higher clock speed and was a lot more competitive. And what I want to do now is just talk about the platforms in general and any compatibility issues or things that you need to be wary about. So first, let's start with the cooling solutions. So the Tualatin, compared to the regular copper mine Pentium 3, have got an integrated heat spreader, and that adds height to the processor. So that has a couple of issues to do with the CPU cooling. So this is a CPU cooler I use a lot. It's a model from StarTech, socket 370. You can buy this new. StarTech is a company that's got really interesting gadgets and adapters and gizmos that no one else has, but they are not the cheapest. So just keep that in mind. One thing I like about this cooler is it's got 3 hooks here. So if you look at the socket, it's got 2 hooks over there and 2 on the other side, so it will spread the load a little bit. And there's a little, you can see here, there's a step, and that step lines up with the socket here. So you put in this side first, and then you go to the other end, and you can see here now that there's a lot of tension. And there's actually too much tension to really be comfortable. Because we can attach it, and I'm just going to risk it. No, I'm not going to risk it because I only have one of these motherboards. But yeah, there's too much tension to be comfortable, and it might actually snap off those hooks. So what you need to do is either you can remove the fan and then take out that bracket here, and just manhandle it. Give it a bit of a bend to reduce the tension. Now we've got another cooler that I can recommend. This one is not available new anymore. This is the Arctic Copper Silent. This one is very interesting because it's got a screw to adjust the tension. So this is probably as good as it gets for the Tualatin. Overkill in terms of cooling power. This is more meant for high-powered Athlon XP processors, but it will work just fine with the socket 370. The other issue lies with motherboard support. The motherboard, especially the chipset, it has to be of a certain revision to support the Tualatin processor. Now usually if you're shopping around for socket 370 motherboards on eBay, the eBay sellers, they will go out of the way to advertise that this motherboard is Tualatin compatible with a price increase to match. However, there are ways around it. There are certain adapters and converters you can use. Personally, I haven't used any of them, but I'm aware of other people out in the community using them with success. So yeah, do a bit of research and maybe you can use one of those adapters with your motherboard. And now let's have a look at the cooling solution for socket 478. You can use an old Intel box cooler, for example, but if you want to buy something new, well, once again, StarTech has a nice 478 cooler, and I really like this one because of the way it mounts. You've got these little brackets here that you mount from the top. So for what I do, which is lots of benchmarking and testing, I really like this way. It's very quick and easy to remove coolers. Now if you're a bit on a budget, because like I mentioned earlier, StarTech is not the cheapest brand. If you're a bit on a budget, you can have a look on eBay and you can find like a knockoff. It says it's from Cooler Master. I'm still not convinced that this is true, but it's a very similar looking model, and it also comes with those brackets, so it works just the same way. The StarTech cooler is rated up to Pentium 4 running at 3 GHz, and that's yep, I've confirmed that is a good rating. These ones here, if you look in the box, it also says 3 GHz, but it struggles a little bit. However, for our old school processors running at 2.2 or 1.4 GHz, this CPU cooler will work just fine. And also a quick word on power supplies. Starting with the Pentium 4, Intel knew that the power draw would go up quite significantly, and traditionally processors and motherboards use the 5-volt rail mostly, but as more and more current needs to go through the wires, it becomes an issue with the cabling, the thickness and how much resistance. So they decided to go with 12 volt instead. So if you look at the Pentium 4 motherboard, it's got a very similar setup to modern computers. So we've got the ATX connector here, and then we've got the 12 volt CPU connector there. So that means any modern ATX power supply, if you plug it in here, it will work just fine. The processor, I believe, has a TDP of only 50 watts, so a decent branded 350 watt power supply will be perfectly fine to run your Pentium 4. On the Pentium 3, we have the ATX connector, but there's no 12 volt CPU power, so most of the current runs from the 5 volt rail, which is how it was back in the day. So this means you have to be a little bit careful. With the Pentium 3, it's not an issue. I believe the Tualatin has a TDP of only 30 watts. Most power supplies, if you look at the 5 volt rating, they've got something like 17 amps or 20 amps. So it's good up to around 100 watts. It just means you have to be a little bit careful with picking your video cards. So going with something like a high-powered GeForce 3 Ti 500, that sucks a lot of power, or like a GeForce 4 is also quite power hungry. So that might not be the best option. You might want to have a look at some models that had a die shrink with a smaller manufacturing process and that draw less power. But I can still say that any modern power supply should be fine with the Pentium 3. It's only once you move to the Athlon and the Athlon XP with processors that have a TDP of 70 watts and higher, then you gotta really be a little bit careful. But the Pentium 3 is still a platform that is very friendly with modern power supplies, so you shouldn't have too many issues. And one more difference between these two platforms is in regards to the CPU instructions. On the Pentium 3, we've got MMX and SSE, whereas the Pentium 4 can do MMX, SSE, and also SSE2. And this means that more modern software will run on the Pentium 4. And also, another thing that I forgot to mention earlier is on our Facebook group, there's a link down below in the description if you're interested. Lots of like-minded people that are into this sort of stuff. He deleted the Pentium 3 Tualatin. and that solves the height issue with the processor cooler. Now, I believe I only have 1 or 2 of these, so I'm not sure if I'm gonna risk it. I'm gonna wait and see if a few other members of the community are gonna do this delete. Maybe there will be a video of someone doing it, and I might look into doing that as well. But that's pretty much it for this video. So back in the day, the Pentium 3S launched quite late, when the Pentium 4 was already up to 2.2 GHz, and it was aimed at the professional server market. But for some reasons, Intel also gave it support with the 8.15 chipset. There's another difference which I forgot, and that is supported memory on the 8.15 chipset. Intel restricted the maximum amount of memory to 512 megabyte, which is a bit unfortunate. For Windows 98 and Millennium Edition, that's not an issue. But if you want to muck around with Windows XP, Service Pack 3, unofficial Service Pack 4, then 512 meg of RAM is becoming a little bit tight. Now, once again, if you go with the VIA chipset motherboard, they have different limitations that are beyond 512 megabyte. On the Pentium 4, I believe the maximum supported memory on this motherboard is 2 gigabytes, which is quite handy, but finding SDRAM memory at that sizes can be a little bit costly. And going forward, future videos that I want to do is looking at the Pentium 4 with SDRAM. So later Intel did an 845 chipset, I believe, that supported SDRAM, and then later DDR, and then later we got DDR dual channel. So it will be interesting to see those chipsets and how they compare to the very early release with the RDRAM RAM bus memory technology. And that's pretty much it for this video. Now, lots of information. This is a really interesting period, transitioning from ISA to PCI, going from Windows 98 to XP, and a very interesting period for Intel with the choice of going with RAM bus, which was very controversial, and a lot of people didn't go with Intel. It either stuck with the SDRAM on a Pentium 3 and just overclocked it and maxed it out or whatever, but a lot of gamers went with the Athlon platform instead, which is also something I do want to look at. I've got most of the parts now, so yeah, really looking forward to that. So if you've got any questions about this video, or maybe I got something wrong, just put it down in the comments. And that's really it for this video. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more stuff like it, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and I shall see you soon with another one.